Imagine building a multi-million-dollar train in the sky only to realise it's actually faster for people to just walk. That is exactly what Sydney did in 1988. The city was preparing for its bicentennial, and the crown jewel was transforming the docks of Darling Harbour into a shiny, world-class tourist precinct. But how do you move millions of cashed-up visitors from the CBD to this new playground? You bypass sensible transit and build what urban planners call a Gadgetbahn. A flashy, high-tech transport solution that looks like pure sci-fi but fails to solve actual problems. The Sydney Monorail was supposed to launch the harbour city into the 21st century. Instead, it became a massive running joke. Stick around, because by the time we're done here, you'll see exactly how a massive American cartoon, a terrible route, and some greedy real estate deals forced the government to buy this monstrosity just so they could destroy it. Trams were considered old hat back then, and heavy underground rail was way too exy. So, when a private firm pitched a sleek monorail, politicians ate it up. But the cracks started showing before the concrete even dried. If you're new here, hi, I'm Dee. I make nostalgic stories about the colourful past of our shared Australian history. Subscribe so you don't miss out. Now back to the story. The absolute biggest clanger of the whole project was the route itself. The monorail was a single-track, one-way loop. If you were at Paddy's Markets and wanted to go just one stop backwards to Chinatown, bad luck, mate. You had to sit there and ride the entire 3.6 kilometre circuit. For locals actually working in the city, it was useless. It was genuinely faster to use your own 2 feet and walk across the Piermont Bridge than it was to wait for the train, buy a ticket, and ride the loop. And speaking of tickets, the integration, or lack thereof, was a complete shocker. It wasn't tied to Sydney's train, bus or ferry networks. You couldn't just use a standard transit pass. You had to buy a completely separate standalone ticket that kept hiking in price, maxing out at $5 a pop by the end. Plus, the physical connections were awful. To catch the bloody thing, you had to navigate through a maze of shopping centre escalators. The real disaster, though, was what this thing did to the city's skyline, and how a certain pop culture phenomenon made the monorail entirely unfixable. Planners originally projected 12 million riders a year. It barely scraped half of that in its early days. Why? Because the carriages were tiny. Each train only seated 48 people, and even packed to the rafters, you could barely cram in 70. As a mass transit solution for a growing global city, it was about as useful as a chocolate bridge. It was strictly a novelty ride for tourists. But Sydney-siders didn't just find it impractical, they hated how it looked. The massive steel pylons snaked right through the narrow streets of the CBD, blocking out the sun and ruining the sightlines of our heritage buildings. It was a massive white elephant. And let's not forget the cultural nail in the coffin. In 1993, The Simpsons dropped the legendary episode Marge versus the Monorail. Almost overnight, the word monorail became international shorthand for a dodgy, useless vanity project sold to gullible politicians. Sydney couldn't escape the joke. So how do you actually kill off a multi-million-dollar piece of heavy infrastructure? Fast forward to 2012. The monorail was tired, rusty, and the novelty had well and truly worn off. Keeping it running required massive investments because buying spare parts for obsolete 80s tech was costing a fortune. The real death knell was real estate. The NSW Government actually bought out the private company that owned the monorail, basically just so they could tear it down. The tracks were physically standing in the way of progress, specifically the new Sydney International Convention Centre and the massive expansion of the street-level light rail network. On June 30th, 2013, the monorail did its final lap. And in true Aussie fashion, people actually queued up for hours for the final ride, feeling a weird tinge of nostalgia for a transport system they'd spent 25 years complaining about. the tracks were ripped down, melted away, or sold off to collectors. Today, Sydney has its street-level trams back. They carry way more people, go both ways, and actually connect to the rest of the grid. The Sydney Monorail was a classic 80s fever dream. Big, flashy, and completely impractical. But honestly, looking back at that retro futuristic train gliding over Darling Harbour, you kind of have to admit, it was a little bit iconic. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and give me a like so I can keep creating more videos. Thanks for watching, folks. Catch you next time. Ta.